Hi, everybody. So slightly different direction and no cool videos, I'm sorry to say. It's a tough act to follow, but going to talk about applications of the NRP that I think are underutilized right now, which is integration into health research. So I'm Benjamin Smarr. I joined UCSD in 2020, or 2019 rather, just in time for things to shut down as I got to campus. So I got here, started my office March 1st, and they said, well, it's, needs to get cleaned out, come back in a week. And of course, in a week, the campus had shut down. I didn't end up with an office for years. So all of the work that I was doing, which was in circadian rhythms, sleep, neuroendocrinology, how your body controls the timing of hormones, all of that got put on hold, and I got drafted by the DoD into helping to figure out, could we use wearable devices, commercially available devices that people already have to detect when people are getting COVID. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that work. I'm going to talk a little bit about how that then enabled me to collaborate with so many people here at UCSD and SDSC. We're using the NRP to drive that work. And then I want to talk a little bit at the end about the sort of public health implications and the ability of things like NRP to reach into underserved communities where they can't afford their own infrastructure, because I think there's a lot of transformative potential there. So I exist. That's great. I want to start with an illustration of the kinds of time series that your body has to deal with that I like this image. This image is now over 10 years old. The blue character is me. The red character is David Burnett, who's now a professor at University of Oregon. He was a graduate student at Berkeley when I was there as a postdoc. And so this is back from 2014. Wearables weren't really a big market yet, right? Fitbit was just taking off in 2014. But we had this belief that if we could measure physiology continuously in an individual, rather than simply say something like your average temperature is, around 98, you must be roughly human, we could say much more interesting things about the patterns of change that those data contain that reflect, in fact, a lot about your hormonal state and your health state to be able to make much more intelligent predictions about health trajectories. So I like this image because if you look, the blue is my skin temperature from a device that David built as a graduate student. We just strapped it onto my wrist. It had a temperature sensor, a light sensor, actigraphy. We're just looking at temperature here. What we've done is we've decomposed my data into sum of several sine waves, and you're looking at a week of my life, 5 days, overlaid on top of each other. So each little blue squiggle is 1 day of my temperature. What you can notice is that I live a very happy old man kind of a life. I was in the Berkeley Hills. I didn't use an alarm clock. I got up when my body wanted me to get up. You can see gray is the nighttime, sunrise and sunset, the week that we were doing this experiment. You see how the blue line sort of gets a little flat. That's because a lot of my hormones that were pulsing while I was awake, responding to meals or waking me up like cortisol, they've flattened out so that I can sleep. So this is what we would expect. And then you can see the rise the next day. My cortisol bumps up. It drives my temperature rhythm to have that bump. We call these ultradian rhythms. So faster than a day, ultradian, faster than a day rhythms. A lot of hormonal systems in your body do this. And if you look at it as a human being, you go, oh, yeah, sure. Like all of those blue lines look basically the same, right? They all fall on top of each other. It looks very orderly. Must be a healthy person, which happily at the time I was. Still, roughly speaking, am, just saying, when these data were gathered. Poor David, on the other hand, is a graduate student in a very competitive engineering lab. And he's getting calls at 3 a.m. This thing is broken. You've got to fix it. Get down here. His schedule is not his own. His life is not his own. And you see it in the data, right? You see that all of these red lines look like spaghetti and chaos rather than this beautiful, stable blue ocean that is my life, apparently. But if you take the aggregate statistics, if you just say, what are the distributions of these functions, that's where we get this box plot. They're completely indistinguishable. And so, when one is training a lot of machine learning algorithms from large data objects that have temporal structure, unless we make a point of explicitly featurizing a lot of that temporal structure, it can wash out unintentionally, and we can lose all of the information that in fact is contained within those time series continuous data. Machine learning has challenges with time series. Clinicians also have challenges with time series because clinicians are used to you coming in, they measure you when you're in the hospital, and that's kind of it. And so they don't also get to see all of those wiggles, right? They don't know were those wiggles chaotic or not, were they high amplitude, were they changing over time? All they know is instantaneously I'm somewhere in this range when I was in the clinic. And so there's this wonderful convergence of problems where we say, okay, as human beings, we can look at something like this, and we can say, obviously, even if the distributions don't change, the shape of the thing tells the story as it changes through time, as we live our lives and our bodies react over time. It's hard to get machines to appreciate those differences, and it's hard to get clinicians to appreciate those differences. And maybe there's a convergence there. Maybe there's a way where as this kind of data becomes more common, as people are using wearable devices more, for example, or even near-body devices, things under your mattress, Wi-Fi picking up your heart rate, all kinds of things that capture our biology over time, maybe that can then be used, featurized, trained to support medical decision-making on people where maybe it's harder to measure them. It's harder to get blood. I don't know about you. I've certainly never given blood every minute continuously for several days. So getting at hormones, getting at things that we need in a time series way is very hard. But as we can see here already, 10 years ago, we knew we could find some information about hormonal stability from the shape of these changes. So COVID started. We had been publishing work like this in various different hormonal regulation schemes. Department of Defense said, there's a pandemic going on. We need to know how people are getting exposed. When are they getting exposed? Unlike, unfortunately, some other funding agencies, they didn't say, no, wearables is toys. Nobody does that. They said, hey, if it's going to help, let's figure it out. So they funded us in the study called TempRedict, where I was then the technical lead with a clinical collaborator up at UCSF, Ashley Mason. And our data looks something like this. So this is the aggregate of many, many dozens of people who got COVID over 2020. The company Aura allowed us sort of in a unique growth spiral in their trajectory as a growing small company. They wanted to do something that would really make a difference and be different. So they let us just reach out to all of their users in the world and ask, would they just donate their data and then tell us over the year, are they developing symptoms? Are they getting COVID? What's going on? From that, within a couple of months of aggregating those data, starting in August, going back, collecting backwards through March, and then prospectively for the rest of the year, by November, we had a working algorithm that was able to detect people were getting sick. And so you can see some of that here. So let me see if I can get this mouse to work. Oh, in fact, is this a laser pointer? Maybe it balances as a laser pointer at night. Anyway. Okay, so what you can see in gray is the week, so sort of plus and minus 3 days from when they were actually able to get a diagnosis. On average, we were detecting COVID with a very high accuracy about 2 or 3 days before that. And again, a few things to notice, right? As a human, you look at this and you're like, well, no, duh. This is heart rate and heart rate variability in red and blue. Heart rate is spiking, heart rate variability is tanking. Here's a fever, so nighttime temperature is going way up. Daytime temperature is also elevated in blue. You can also start to notice recovery. So temperature does not go back to normal right away. It takes quite a while for things to restabilize. Here we're looking at respiration in red and activity in blue. And again, they start getting sick and you can see this inflammation building. And then it stays for a long time. And in some individuals, we saw this stay as long as we had data, right? Many months of staying physiologically aberrant. But there's a few things to also take from this. So these big spikes are not noise. These big spikes are daily rhythms. Everybody has a daily rhythm of their heart rate, of their temperature. You saw some of that from me a moment ago. And the variance of those days can be as high as until you're very sick. And for those that don't have a severe case, it can be as high as their entire sickness. And so again, if you only have the aggregate statistics across people, then the fact that I'm an old man going to bed, living like an old man going to bed early, looks very different from maybe some of my students who are staying up coding at 3 a.m. still. All of that time of day information blurs out if we aggregate the data instead of the rhythmic structure of the data. Similarly, these big aberrations are really, really clear, especially when you look by time of day. And so you can start to notice somebody's getting a fever a few days before they feel sick. Not because they're hotter than 98.6 at any point, but because they're hotter than they should be for that time of day, even if at that time of day they should be relatively cool. So you can start to notice the dysregulation of these patterns. So we've got all these cases. We made some explainable AI models, which were really just forest models. That is to say, if I see your temperature doing this at this time of day, plus also I see your heart rate doing this, plus also a number of other things, that looks like COVID. And in fact, like a acute illness, so like the flu very similarly. So raises some interesting questions, right? So we know that this can change. We know that as humans we can see these things. The challenge is the right way to featureize all of the signal processing that goes into pulling out parameters of these data so that they can then be fed into machine learning models. It also raises this question of sort of what's normal. And so I want to pivot from this to saying something that was kind of embarrassing, where coming from neuroendocrinology, a lot of my thesis was in ovulation and women's health. And yet, because we were doing this in such a rush, our very first model was really, really accurate in men. And if there were ovulating women, every time they ovulated, and for those of you in the audience that don't know this, when you ovulate, your temperature rises, your heart rate rises, your sleep falls apart a little bit. And so every time we were sending these false alarms to people saying, it looks like you should test, it looks like you might have COVID, really all we were saying is it looks like you just ovulated, right? It was a completely preventable false positive. And it raises this larger philosophical problem, which is we're not all physiologically the same. And the shape of those changes across time have a lot to do with what drugs are we going to respond to, what physiological systems need management, what is absolutely not a disease, but ovulation or pregnancy or something like that, totally normal that you shouldn't be sending alarms for. So really philosophically now we're having to grapple with what is baseline, what is normal for whom, over what time scale, and these are not obvious questions, they're not solved. So these data let us look and do some explorations. I want to just sort of sing the praises of Lauren Bruce, one of my graduate students, did very nice work taking a simple example of menstrual cycles and saying if we had no information, we have no labels, right? But we know that some women are cycling. So if we just look at the physiology, can we see that? And we pull out these women. She developed this whole classifier. I'll show you just a cartoon of it briefly. Saying, okay, well, obviously temperature should cycle every 28 days-ish. But of course, even though this is remarkably understudied, no woman in our 65,000 person data set is a completely stable cycler. So it's about 28 days-ish, depending on how you map the cycles, as you can see in this heat map where each pixel is a day. Some women are a little faster, some women are a little slower, some people are unstable cycle to cycle. In fact, everybody is a little bit. But you can look at this again as a human and you can say, okay, blue, red, big stripes. Clearly some cyclic thing is happening across these people. You can then use that variability as a feature to classify these women as cyclic, as opposed to the women and the men that are acyclic, that are not having menstrual cycles. And again, you can see by eye pretty clearly, lots of women do not have stable menstrual cycles for all kinds of very reasonable reasons. For example, all of the women above 60 in our study stop having menstrual cycles, which is just menopause, normal. The men are also not having monthly cycles. There's no menopause in our data that we've found. And so we can start to classify people not based on a category like sex, which you would normally, all of us probably have checked that box a dozen times at UCSD or whatever institute you're coming from. That's not the feature we care about. What we care about is what sex was a proxy for, which was, did you have this time scale of variance that predictably changes your physiology, that as a result changes the surface the algorithm is trying to bind to, trying to recognize sickness, predictably having these oscillations as a change of baseline. So she published this. She got some features in WAPO, which was very nice, trying to support statistical inclusion of women as research subjects. A lot of times in the past, people have looked at these rhythms and said, that's crazy. My statistics will fall apart with all that structured variance. Let's just not study women. Clearly, this is not a scalable outcome for medical systems in the world. So what we were showing here is, these things are real. These things are detectable. Sex is not really the right proxy. You don't need a proxy if you have time series data. You can just find these things. And in fact, statistically, because it's so structured, any of you might guess, if I pointed to any random day, do you think it's going to be blue or red, right? For the women, you go, yeah, over here, probably bluish. Here with the people that are acyclic, you really can't guess very well, right? The variance is actually much more random and harder to map in the acyclic individuals, which is the opposite of what had been expected. So she built this classifier tree. Again, this is just the simplest possible example of the nuance of what is baseline, but I think it tells a nice story. We can classify everybody by their the dynamic time warping distance of their autocorrelative curve. So that is to say, if we look at somebody across time, and we say, if I take you, your time series, and I shift it a day, I can get a correlation of how similar are you to yourself. I shift it another day, another day, another day, another day. And for some individuals, there's this cycle to when are you most like yourself. Again, not exactly 28 days for everybody, but very clearly quantifiable. And then we look at the dynamic time warping distance, which is a sort of how similar is this blue wiggle to that other person's blue wiggle or to this person's red wiggle. And we can, with very high fidelity, pull out those individuals that have physiological cycles. This red person is an outlier that's easily reclassified. We put them back in this bin. And then this is all of the men, none of whom show that cycling structure, and all of the women who are not cyclic. So allows systematic classification of a physiotype as opposed to a demographic variable like male or female. Physiologically relevant then for, in this case, COVID detection, but of course also drug timing, interventions. Very useful to know that kind of timing information. We completely removed the false positives. We increased our accuracy up into the high 90s by doing that so that it was a much more equitable algorithm across the whole population, which is really exciting. And it suggests philosophically that there's a lot of work to be done still where we have to know what is physiological diversity, what makes people look different from each other, not in terms of their genes, not in terms of their skin color or their sex, but actually what's happening in their body day by day. And so you can imagine lots of applications, like somebody is turning 75 or 80. That really doesn't tell you a lot about what's happening inside them. Are they turning 75 or 80 and it looks like their physiology is falling apart and you should worry? Or are they, a rock star and doing really well and very healthy and you don't need to worry, right? The number 80 tells you much less than the physiological state, which you can pull out in this kind of signal processing way. So I'm going to talk now about how being able to run this trial where we actually were alerting thousands of medical first responders about COVID exposure, how that only was possible here, because I strongly believe that. So the other Dr. Smarr provided this slide of the usage from my lab. You can see we spike a lot of CPUs. A lot of what we'd been doing in the past was either what was immediately capable of being picked up and used and or feasibility studies showing that these kinds of things are possible. But I've started trying to drive home to the students that just showing that something is possible doesn't make it deployable in the world, because in the world you might want things to be more efficient or more parallelizable, more scalable, so that they could be adopted over a large population efficiently, computationally efficiently. And so I said, guys, you've got to get on the GPU game. It's going to make this so much faster. And they said, no, come on. It runs overnight. I don't care. It's fine. I said, no, I care. It's not fine. Go figure out how to do the GPUs. The reason they can do that, so you see now there's this uptick of GPU usage going on, is they were able to connect through the NRP. And they said, well, who else is using the NRP and killing it with GPUs? We can start talking to them. We can start talking to the managers, right? Dima sitting here provides extraordinary support and can also reference, who else is having what usage patterns? Go figure it out from them. And they're starting to do that, which is really encouraging, right? It's coming from the fact that there's this community that the students are gaining that empowerment. So I want to say, again, very briefly, the kinds of things that this was enabling back in 2020, 2021 that we're now building on. Many different kinds of machine learning. I'm not going to go through the details here. They don't matter. But the point is, all of these things fail if you don't help them have the right feature sets, the right signal processing of rhythmic structure that the physiology is really based on, oscillating structures mostly. So for that, we also then have to couple this with a lot of unsupervised learning. So supervised learning is saying, I want my robot to dance and here's all the parameters and I know those already. Whereas in the physiology, unfortunately, we still don't know what are the right parameters. Nobody's ever seen physiology continuously over years like this. So it's a new field. So we do a lot of large dimensional reduction, UMAPs, this kind of exploration, which lets us see distributions in these very large dimensional spaces to say, okay, well, here's all of women, here's all of men, but there's a ton of overlap, there's a ton of different physiological features. Systematically, what were the most separating features for the men or the women who then also developed diabetes or COVID or some other condition? And so we then spiral those things. Those become the features for the supervised learning as a result. So the very simple schema here, I think we can go ahead and jump to the slightly more complex schema. So we had these problems. We said, okay, I came in and had this weird crash landing as a professor where I said, okay, all of a sudden, apparently, I'm an epidemiology computer scientist, with neither of which was my training. But I know these rhythms are there. I know we can do the computation. We'll figure it out. I knew Ilka Altintas previously, and she was incredibly helpful introducing me to a lot of people at SDSC, who then said, for example, yeah, well, we've got awesome storage, which scrapes all of Twitter every day and is massive and dynamic. Why don't we use that? And we can put all your wearable data there. We can get data collected through S3s that the companies rely on, and we can push them into our secure S3 systems at Sherlock, which Sandeep was managing and was incredibly helpful, helping me learn how to interact with those systems. But we had some unique challenges because we needed to maintain IRB compliance, which is to say we're using human data, we're looking at medical outcomes. So there's an extra level of rigor that's required here. We're also working with Department of Defense. They need all of this to have extra layers of protection. We then need to take all of that data, which is protected, which is encrypted and hashed and all these things, and we need to be able to look at it fast enough across thousands of people that every day we can send out an email early in the morning and say, you need to take your test, things are looking funny. We did that, right? That actually worked. And the way we were able to do that, the solution for that was to segregate the identifiable data from the data that was being de-identified and chewed up and processed in encrypted encoded. And then all of the IDs, only those IDs, to reduce the problem, only those IDs that looked like they were triggered by our algorithm, we could push back a hashed version of that back into the secure system, Sherlock. And from Sherlock, because Subhashish Dasgupta and Sandeep were able to work together between Timescale DB, where Subhashish was managing, and Sherlock, where Sandeep was managing, we're able to then open up some secure portals, make sure that the data going into this secure thing to look up IDs was only ever exactly what it was supposed to be and not somebody else. We never even saw that then. That would then get pushed as a list of IDs without any other identifiable information to San Francisco. And in San Francisco, again, segregated, the clinicians had this list of, okay, what ID is which person and what's their email and let's get it, or what's their phone number and we can contact them. So the personal identifiable security was never violated. And yet using this distributed infrastructure, which allowed us to be very nimble and grow what we needed to grow, and because there was this very supportive community of people at SDSC, like a few of those that I've mentioned, we were able to throw all of this together in the space of about 2 or 3 months and actually make it work and provide these alerts to clinicians that were trying to fight the surge in early 2021. Definitely not something I would have been able to do. So I'm really just very appreciative that I'm in this environment where we could build something like this. I just want to end on a note of saying the sort of interesting potential ahead of us. So this is a now very old slide, but it was the county by county COVID levels that were being aggregated by UC Davis. And in contrast, what I'm showing down here is the little cartoon of a human with real data of them very fuzzily, the real raw data, and then smoothing to make it more obvious where they have a fever, where they get sick. The challenge is to say, okay, public health is great. Public health tells us all kinds of things about, for example, looks like California's in a surge right now in this map. But public health is kind of like aggregate statistics. It's not actually very useful for the individual data point. What we want to do is say, well, what's the public health surveillance or sort of weather radar, as I like to think of it, that nevertheless actually comes back to the resolution of the individual generating these data. A, we can make better use of those data without aggregating them by signal processing them. And B, we can keep these data actionable even though we're surveying very large distributed populations. So we sort of imagine overlaying this with the actual humans that are the tracer particles that generate these maps. Of course, UCSD is a great place for this. There's a ton of different partner institutions that we work with to build this kind of system. And there's a few challenges that I think face a lot of people in this field that may not be obvious. So I'm just going to say them very briefly. Tech access is not equitable. So we had really good data from people in La Jolla during this work. We tried to reach out to Imperial County, where the COVID load was 10 times higher than it was in La Jolla. And we were really not able to do that. They didn't have devices, so we needed to get money to give them devices. But even then, a lot of people at Imperial County said, let me get this straight. You want somebody from UCSD to come put a tracking device on me And it's definitely only going to be for my own good. Yeah, thanks. So there are some very, very serious cultural barriers, right? Trust barriers that unfortunately have been earned. And it's going to take a long time to figure out what is the safe, equitable, uncreepy way to provide this kind of support. Because instead of these county levels, which took up to 4 weeks to get to the CDC, by which the COVID has moved on, we were doing this daily before people felt sick every day. So the potential is really transformative, both for public health and the individuals. The science problems we're solving, there are also these really interesting social problems. So the last thing I'll say is we're now collaborating with some minority-serving institutions. I have a partner at Northeastern Illinois University that we're focusing with. They're never going to have the money. It's a community-serving commuter school, highly diverse. They're never going to have the money for their own supercomputer center. They barely have the money for anybody there to get servers. They don't get a ton of grants, right? They're not an R1 institute. But they can get on NRP real easy. They're there. So we're building infrastructure now together where their students can learn how to do this kind of cutting-edge medical research without any infrastructure support locally. And I think that's super empowering for all these communities that then can be part of that development, can make sure their stories are captured and treated more equitably than waiting for a large central hospital system to notice that they're not generating data and go seek them, which most of us just don't have that extra time, right? So with that, I'll say thank you. Small group of my lab members at one of our picnics, because San Diego is amazing. Again, I really do want to call out Sandeep and his team, Ilkay and her team, Tom Defani and Larry Smarr and Rajesh for the leadership that helped bring these groups together, that helped share this vision. I know I'm not mentioning everybody. I called out Dima, but of course all of this happens with a huge amount of support. And so thank you. I think that's my time anyway. Thank you.
Any questions?
So Ben, what happens next? Meaning, is COVID still relevant to you? And how do you move? What's the next problem that you want to address with this?
Sure. So COVID is still relevant. Obviously, it's not a huge thing. And in fact, the DoD, where we're still working with, said, this is awesome. We're deploying it. We're using the things you built. That's great. We actually don't take a lot of people out of the field because of COVID, though. We take most of them out of the field because they're lonely, they're depressed, they're burned out. So we've moved a lot of this towards behavioral health detection. And that actually has a lot of implications for aging. So I'm also the associate director at the Stein Institute for Research on Aging. As I said, if it looks like you're taking a nap every day and it's a siesta and it's normal and it's healthy, that's great. If it looks like, however, you're taking naps every day because your sleep is fracturing and your sleep regulation is failing, that's an early sign for Alzheimer's. So getting at the physiological early detections of probable behavioral health issues in that way. But then again, underneath all of that is this equity and diversity issue, right? I think everybody takes for granted that, you and I are both white males does not describe us in great depth, right? And genomically, we would find all these interesting different ancestries, maybe different susceptibilities to different drugs. But our genes aren't fundamentally changing day to day, right? Our 23andMe isn't going to update itself hourly, or it'd be kind of a waste anyway. But our physiology changes all the time. So what is physiological diversity? What does it mean to have a digital twin in some meaningful way that affects medical decision making? So then there's a lot of clinical collaborations to try to do that learning.
Cool.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much.